Welcome, dear listener. As you lie there, your body cushioned by your bed, the soft glow of the moonlight slipping through the curtains, let your mind wander into the realm of history. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey back in time to an era of knights and castles, of lords and serfs. It was a period of both intense hardship and remarkable innovation, a time that has captivated the human imagination for centuries, the Middle Ages. Tonight, we will explore why you, a modern individual, would find it almost impossible to last a single day in this era. The Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period, spanned from the 5th to the 15th century. It started with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and merged into the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. To set the scene, imagine a landscape dotted with grand castles, their stone walls standing tall against the backdrop of the sky. Picture villages of thatched roof cottages, their chimneys puffing out smoke. See the people, the nobles in their fine silks, the peasants in their simple clothes, the monks in their solemn robes. Hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cows, the bustle of the market. However, life in this era was far from the romanticized version we often see in movies or read in books. It was in fact a period characterized by great struggle and adversity. The average life expectancy was around 30 years, and a vast majority of the populace lived in abject poverty. Sanitation was poor, disease was rampant, and the threat of war was an ever-present reality. One of the most striking differences between our time and the Middle Ages is the lack of modern conveniences that we take for granted. Imagine a life without electricity, without running water, without central heating. In the winter, you would have to rely on a fireplace for heat, with the risk of the fire going out in the middle of the night. In the summer, there was no escape from the heat and the swarms of insects that came with it. No endless streams of videos offering calming sensory experiences, no grand entertainment spectacles from popular creators, no instant access to your favorite songs or gaming highlights. You might think that the simple act of eating would be a respite from these hardships, but even this was fraught with difficulty. Food was often scarce and of poor quality. The diet of the average peasant was limited to bread, vegetables, and a little dairy. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even if you were lucky enough to get your hands on some, there were no refrigerators to keep it fresh. Food poisoning was a common occurrence and could easily prove fatal. Water, too, was not as readily available as it is today. Wells were the primary source of drinking water, but these were often contaminated. As a result, people frequently drank ale or beer, as the alcohol killed some of the harmful bacteria. However, this led to a whole other set of problems as excessive drinking was common. Hygiene was another area in which medieval times vastly differed from today. Bathing was not a daily or even weekly occurrence. In fact, it was believed that bathing opened the pores to disease, and so was avoided when possible. As a result, people often had lice, fleas, and other parasites. The lack of dental care meant that tooth decay was rampant, and the solution was usually extraction without any form of anesthesia. Medicine, too, was a far cry from what we know today. Doctors had a limited understanding of the human body and disease, and their treatments were often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was a common practice based on the belief that it could balance the body's humors. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, and the mortality rate was extremely high. In conclusion, life in the Middle Ages was fraught with struggles and hardships that we in our modern era would find almost impossible to bear. We can be grateful for the progress we have made and the comforts we now enjoy. As you drift off to sleep, ponder on these thoughts and let the echoes of the past gently lull you into dreams. Until our next historical journey, good night. Let's continue our journey through medieval times with a closer look at the living conditions. If you're fond of modern amenities like running water, electricity, or even just a comfortable bed, Medieval times would have been a shock to your system. Houses during this era were usually made of a wooden frame filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched with straw, which provided a modicum of insulation. However, the walls were thin and the homes lacked any real heating source, making winters bitterly cold. Fireplaces were a luxury that few could afford, so most people huddled around a central hearth for warmth. The smoke from this open fire had to escape from a hole in the roof, which meant that the interior of the home was often choked with smoke. Imagine trying to find comfort in such a setting, huddled with your family members, your eyes stinging from the smoke. Most homes consisted of a single room that served multiple purposes. The same room that was used for cooking and eating was also the sleeping quarters. Privacy was a concept virtually unheard of, as entire families would sleep together in the same space, often on a single bed of straw. If you found the idea of sharing a bedroom with a sibling frustrating as a child, imagine sharing a bed with your entire family. Sanitation, or rather the lack of it, would be another shock to the modern system. There were no bathrooms as we know them. Instead, people would use chamber pots, which were emptied out of windows and onto the streets below. The waste would then run down the streets and into the local rivers, which were also the primary sources of drinking water. The result was rampant disease, from dysentery to the plague. The smell alone would be enough to make the strongest stomachs churn. This brings us to the topic of personal hygiene. The idea of daily showers would have been unimaginable to the people of the Middle Ages. Most people bathed rarely, and when they did, it was often in the local river or a community bathhouse. These bathhouses, while providing a place for communal bathing, were also a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. There was a prevalent belief during this time that bathing opened the pores to disease. So many people chose to bathe as infrequently as possible. This meant that people often carried a strong odor, which was only masked by the use of herbs and flowers. Food in the Middle Ages was also a far cry from what we're accustomed to today. The average person's diet consisted of bread, cheese, and ale. Meat was a luxury that few could afford, and fresh fruits and vegetables were not a common part of the diet. Malnutrition was a common problem as the diet lacked many essential vitamins and nutrients. It wasn't all hardship and struggle, however. There were moments of joy and celebration, often centered around religious holidays and feasts. Music and dance were important parts of medieval culture, providing a much-needed escape from the harsh realities of daily life. People would gather in the village square to dance, sing, and celebrate. Even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to shine through. So, as we close this chapter, take a moment to appreciate the comforts of modern life. The next time you take a hot shower, sleep in a warm bed, or enjoy a fresh, healthy meal, remember how far we've come. The Middle Ages may have been a time of great cultural and intellectual growth, but they were also a time of hardship and struggle. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that we've come so far. In our next section, we'll dive deeper into the social structure of the Middle Ages, exploring the roles of the king, nobles, knights, and peasants. Stay tuned and let the soothing rhythm of history lull you into a peaceful slumber. No endless scroll through gaming content or trending music videos here, just the rhythm of life. As the sun creeps over the horizon, our medieval day begins. Life in the Middle Ages was dictated by the sun. It determined when you woke, when you worked, and when you slept. In a world without electricity, daylight was precious, and every ray of sun had to be used for vital chores and tasks. If you're imagining the luxury of a lazy Sunday morning, think again. Medieval folk were early risers, typically getting up at the crack of dawn, as signaled by the crowing of a rooster or the tolling of the local church bell. Once out of bed, people would dress in simple tunics made of coarse wool, linen, or hemp, depending on their wealth and status. The wealthy might have clothes dyed in brighter colors and made of finer materials, but the majority wore drab, practical clothing, not unlike the sackcloth of biblical fame. Shoes were a luxury, with most peasants going barefoot, especially in warmer months. The first meal of the day was breakfast, but this wasn't the feast of bacon, eggs, and toast that we're accustomed to. Medieval breakfast was a frugal affair, often consisting of a chunk of bread, some cheese, and, if they were lucky, a bit of cold meat or fish from the previous night's meal. This would be washed down with a mug of ale or, for the wealthier folk, wine. Yes, you heard that right. Water was often unsafe to drink due to poor sanitation, so low-alcohol ale and wine were common beverages, even for children. After breakfast, it was straight to work. The majority of medieval people were peasants, working the land for the local lord. Their days were filled with hard physical labor, plowing fields, sowing seeds, tending animals, and harvesting crops. Even children were expected to contribute with tasks appropriate to their age and strength. The work was backbreaking, and the hours were long from dawn until dusk. The fields and pastures were a hive of activity, with only a short break at midday for a meal and rest. If you were lucky enough to be a craftsman, your day might involve working in a shop or at a market stall, selling your wares. Blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, and weavers were all critical to the medieval economy. Their skills were in high demand, and their products, horseshoes, bread, furniture, and cloth, were essential for daily life. However, these jobs weren't without their hardships. The work was often dangerous, with the risk of injury or even death from accidents or fires. In contrast, the life of a noble or a knight was very different. They didn't labor in the fields, but they were busy with their own duties and responsibilities. They had to manage their estates, administer justice, train for war, and engage in politics. The noble's day was filled with meetings, decisions, and paperwork, much like a modern CEO. As the sun began to set, the day's work would come to an end. Supper was the main meal of the day, usually consisting of a hearty stew made of meat, vegetables, and grains. The wealthier you were, the more varied and extravagant your diet would be. The rich feasted on roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries, washed down with fine wines. After supper, people would gather around the hearth for a few hours of relaxation before bed. They might tell stories, play simple games, or just enjoy the warmth and companionship of their family and friends. Then, as the last embers in the hearth died out, it was time for bed. Beds were simple affairs, often just a pile of straw covered with a blanket. Only the wealthy had the luxury of a wooden bedstead, stuffed mattress, and feather pillows. As you lay down to sleep, you would be aware of the silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. There were no streetlights, no cars, no electric hum, just the dark and the quiet. And with that, your day in medieval times would come to an end, ready to start again with the crowing of the rooster at dawn. So, as you settle into your comfortable modern bed tonight, spare a thought for our medieval ancestors. Their lives were hard, and their comforts were few, but they made the best of what they had. They worked, they laughed, they loved, and they slept just like we do. They were, in essence, just like us, only their world was a very different place. Imagine a world without trending videos of celebrity antics, gaming streams, or viral music challenges, just the simple, unadorned rhythm of existence. As we delve deeper into the details of medieval life, we find ourselves standing in the middle of a bustling medieval marketplace, a sensory overload of sights, sounds, and smells. The marketplace was the economic center of medieval society, a place where merchants and craftsmen came to sell their wares and where peasants came to purchase essential goods for survival. Imagine the cacophony of vendors hawking their wares, the clatter of carts, and the lowing of livestock. The scent of fresh bread wafted from the baker's stall, alongside the less pleasant stench of unwashed people and animals. Goods would have included everything from foodstuffs like bread, cheese, and vegetables to manufactured items like clothing, household goods, and tools. It's worth noting that in these times, currency wasn't as prevalent as it is today. Bartering was a common practice, and goods would often be exchanged for other goods or services. So, if you were a craftsperson, you might trade a handcrafted tool for a sack of grain or a pair of shoes. Food, of course, was a critical part of daily life in the Middle Ages. Contrary to popular belief, medieval food wasn't all gruel and stale bread. The diet of an average person revolved around grains such as barley, oats, rye, and wheat. Bread, porridge, and ale made from these grains would have been staples. Vegetables like cabbages, onions, garlic, and leeks were common, as were fruits like apples, pears, and berries. Meat and fish were also consumed, but less frequently, typically reserved for those of higher social status or special occasions. Now, imagine the water you drink and the food you eat being prepared in medieval conditions. There was no knowledge of bacteria and the role they played in causing disease. Water was often taken straight from rivers or wells, which could be contaminated with human and animal waste. Food was often stored in unsanitary conditions, and there was no refrigeration. This led to frequent outbreaks of diseases like dysentery and cholera. In addition to the marketplace, the other bustling center of activity in the medieval village would have been the manor, home to the local lord. The lord was the most powerful person in the village, responsible for maintaining law and order, administering justice, and protecting the villagers from outside threats. In return, the villagers were expected to work the lord-sized lands and pay him rent in the form of goods or services. The manor house itself would have been a large, fortified structure, often surrounded by a moat for protection. Inside, you'd find a great hall where the lord would hold court, a chapel for religious services, and private chambers for the lord and his family. Despite the grandeur of the manor house, life inside wasn't luxurious by modern standards. There was no indoor plumbing, and heating was provided by large, smoky fires. The lord's power wasn't absolute, however. He was subject to the king, who held ultimate authority. The relationship between the lord and the king was based on a system of mutual obligations known as feudalism. The lord pledged his loyalty to the king and provided him with military service when needed. In return, the king granted the lord lands and rights over the people who lived on them. This feudal system was a fundamental aspect of medieval society, creating a hierarchy of power and privilege. At the top were the king and the nobility, who owned the land and controlled the wealth. Below them were the knights, who provided military service in exchange for land and status. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land and had few rights or freedoms. In the next section, we will explore the harsh reality of medieval warfare and the role of knights in society. But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on the fact that this was a time when survival was a daily struggle, and the creature comforts we enjoy today were inconceivable luxuries. As we drift off into a peaceful sleep, let us appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern lives and the progress that has been made over the centuries. In the end, the Middle Ages were a time of great hardship and adversity, but also a time of remarkable resilience and innovation. Life was difficult, but people found ways to adapt and survive, to create beauty and meaning in the midst of their challenges. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of the Middle Ages, the capacity of the human spirit to endure and to flourish, even in the harshest of circumstances. So, as we close our eyes and surrender to the soothing embrace of sleep, let's carry that thought with us into our dreams, a reminder of the strength and resilience that resides within each of us. Imagine trading your daily dose of trending news or your favorite artist's latest song for the struggle of a medieval market, a stark contrast indeed. As we delve deeper into the daily life of the medieval period, It is important to note that the rhythm of the day was very different than the one we are used to in our modern times. It was a time when the sun served as the main indicator of the hour, and the need for survival necessitated early rising. A typical day would start at dawn with a quick meal known as breakfast, a term borrowed from the Old English breakfasta, which literally means to break the night's fast. This meal was usually a simple affair consisting of a chunk of bread, some cheese, and perhaps a cup of ale. Following breakfast, the majority of the day was dedicated to work. The type of work varied greatly depending on one's social status. If you were a peasant, your day would be filled with grueling physical labor. Medieval peasants were essentially farmers and worked the land to produce the food required to feed the entire kingdom. They planted and harvested crops, raised livestock, and did whatever else was necessary to maintain the estate they lived on. If you were born into the nobility, your day would look very different. While nobles didn't have to perform physical labor, they were responsible for managing the land and the people who lived on it. They made important decisions about when to plant and harvest crops, how to distribute resources, and how to defend their land in the event of conflict. This was no easy task and required a great deal of strategic thinking and interpersonal skills. The middle class, which consisted of merchants and craftsmen, also had their own set of responsibilities. A merchant's day might be spent acquiring goods and then selling them in the market. They would have to keep track of inventory, negotiate prices, and navigate the complex world of medieval trade. Craftsmen, on the other hand, would spend their days creating the goods sold in the market. They would have to master their craft, whether it was blacksmithing, weaving, or carpentry, and produce high-quality products that would sell well. Lunch, the main meal of the day, was taken around midday. This was a more substantial meal than breakfast and typically consisted of several courses. Bread was still the staple, but it would be accompanied by meat or fish, vegetables, and a variety of sauces and spices. The meal would be washed down with ale or wine, as water was often unsafe to drink. After lunch, work would resume until dusk. The evening meal was similar to breakfast, a simple and quick affair. After this, people would retire to their beds. There was no concept of leisure time as we know it today. Free time was a luxury very few people could afford. The medieval period was a time of hard work and simplicity. Life was dictated by the seasons and the demands of survival. But despite its hardships, it was also a time of community and shared responsibility. People relied on each other for survival and worked together to ensure the well-being of their community. It was a time when the line between life and death was often thin, but it was also a time when people truly lived in the moment, aware of the fragility of life and the importance of each day. As we continue our journey through medieval times, remember to keep in mind the vast differences between our modern lives and those of our ancestors. It's easy to romanticize the past, but the reality was often much more complex and challenging. Yet, it's also important to remember that our ancestors were just as human as we are. They laughed, cried, loved, and dreamed, just like we do. They were a product of their time, just as we are a product of ours. As we learn more about their lives, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own history and perhaps even a new perspective on our own lives. Now, as you close your eyes and drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to medieval times. Imagine the sound of the rooster crowing at dawn, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, the feeling of the cool morning air on your face as you step outside to start your day. Let these images lull you to sleep as we prepare to continue our journey through medieval times in our next session. No scrolling through endless gaming content, no watching viral ISAM or videos for relaxation, just the raw reality of daily existence. As we continue our journey through the medieval period, delving into the everyday life of the average person, we find ourselves stepping into the world of a medieval peasant. The life of a peasant during medieval times was drastically different from the lives we lead today, filled with hardships and adversity that are difficult for us to fully comprehend. The average peasant's day started at dawn with the rising of the sun. This was long before the invention of alarm clocks, so the first light of day signaled the beginning of their labor-intensive routines. The majority of peasants were farmers, their lives strictly dictated by the changing seasons and what they could grow. In the spring, they would begin by plowing their fields using rudimentary tools made from wood and iron. This was a grueling task, often taking several weeks to complete. Once the fields were plowed, they would then begin sowing the seeds for their crops. Wheat, barley, oats, rye, and legumes were among the most common crops grown. The work was backbreaking, requiring long hours of physical labor in the fields. After the seeding process, the peasants' focus shifted to the maintenance of their crops. They would spend the summer months weeding and ensuring their crops received enough water. This was a constant battle against nature, as unexpected storms or droughts could easily destroy their hard work and leave them without food for the coming winter. When autumn arrived, it was time for the peasants to reap what they had sown. The harvest was a crucial time, determining whether they would have enough food to survive the winter. After the harvest, the remaining stalks and straw were used for a variety of purposes. They provided fodder for livestock, bedding for the family, and thatch for the roofs of their homes. Winter, in contrast, was a time of relative inactivity. The fields lay fallow, and the peasants spent their time carrying out repair work on their homes or tools, as well as tending to their livestock. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens were typical animals a peasant might raise. These animals provided them with essential resources like milk, wool, meat, and eggs. In addition to farming, peasants also had to pay taxes to their feudal lord. These taxes were often paid in the form of crops or labor. It wasn't uncommon for a peasant to spend several days each year working on the lord's lands as part of their tax obligation. This was known as the corvée system and was a significant burden on the peasant population. Despite the hardships, life wasn't always work for the peasants. They did have some time for rest and recreation. Sundays were usually kept as a day of rest and worship. The church played a significant role in the lives of the peasants, providing them with spiritual guidance and a sense of community. Festivals and holy days also gave them a chance to take a break from their labor and celebrate with friends and neighbors. Marriages and births were cause for celebration, and even the harshness of winter brought with it the joy of Christmas festivities. Music and dance were popular forms of entertainment, and despite their difficult lives, the peasants found ways to express their creativity and joy. However, the life of a peasant in medieval times was undoubtedly difficult. The physical labor was intense, the diet was poor, and the living conditions were often cramped and unsanitary. Illness and disease were common, and the average life expectancy was significantly lower than it is today. Despite these conditions, the medieval peasant was a resilient individual. They adapted to their circumstances, found joy in the simple pleasures of life, and formed close-knit communities that helped them survive. Their lives were far from easy, but they laid the groundwork for many of the farming practices we still use today. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let's appreciate the comforts and conveniences of modern life that we often take for granted. As we journey further into the past, we continue to gain perspective on our present, understanding the struggles and triumphs that have shaped our world. In our next section, we will explore the world of the medieval knight, tunneling deeper into the intricate layers of medieval society. But for now, let the rhythm of a peasant's life lull us into a peaceful and restful slumber. Good night. Imagine a world where your daily trending content was simply the cycle of the seasons and the demands of the land, rather than the latest viral video or popular song. In our 7th segment, we delve into the social structure of the medieval era, a time when society was starkly divided into classes, and one's birth essentially determined the course of their life. The feudal system, the primary social structure during the medieval period, was akin to a pyramid. At the top was the king, who granted land to his most important noblemen, known as barons. Below the barons were the knights, and at the very bottom were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Life at the top of the pyramid was relatively comfortable. Kings and noblemen lived in grand castles, surrounded by servants who catered to their every whim. They dined on a variety of foods, including meat, fish, and exotic fruits, while wearing luxurious clothing made of silk and velvet. Despite this, their lives were far from easy. Kings and noblemen were constantly involved in political maneuvering and warfare as they sought to protect their lands and increase their power. Knights, situated in the middle of the social pyramid, had a slightly different experience. They were granted land by their lords in return for military service. Knights were expected to be brave, chivalrous, and skilled in combat. Their lives were dominated by warfare and the pursuit of honor. Despite the romanticized image we have of knights today, their lives were often brutal and short. Many knights died young, either in battle or as a result of injuries they sustained. Life at the bottom of the pyramid, the life of a peasant, was incredibly hard. Peasants worked long hours in the fields, growing crops to feed themselves and their lords. They lived in simple, one-room huts with dirt floors and few possessions. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, vegetables, and occasionally a bit of cheese or bacon. Despite their hard work, peasants were often at the mercy of their lords, who could raise rents or demand more labor at any time. The medieval period was also a time of religious fervor. The Catholic Church was the dominant religious institution, and its influence permeated every aspect of life. The Pope, who was considered God's representative on earth, held enormous power. People were expected to attend church services regularly, pay tithes to the church, and live their lives according to Christian teachings. Those who didn't were considered heretics and could face severe punishment, including excommunication or even death. The Middle Ages were also a time of great intellectual activity. Despite widespread illiteracy, monasteries were centers of learning, where monks painstakingly copied books by hand. These works, many of them religious texts, were the primary source of knowledge during this time. The medieval era was a time of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was a time of great beauty, with the construction of magnificent cathedrals and the creation of stunning works of art. On the other hand, it was a time of great brutality and suffering, with constant warfare, widespread poverty, and a lack of basic human rights. As we continue our journey through the medieval era, we will explore more about the lives of the people who lived during this time, the challenges they faced, and the innovations they made. Despite the hardships, the medieval period was a time of great change and progress, setting the stage for the modern world we know today. Take a moment to imagine living in this era, the sounds of the marketplace, the smell of the earth after a day in the fields, the taste of simple, hearty food after a hard day's work. As you do, let the stress and worries of your day fade away, replaced by a feeling of peace and tranquility. No online gaming communities, no viral memes or celebrity news to consume, just the rigid hierarchy and constant demands of your place in society. Let us continue our in-depth exploration into the daily life of the medieval period. As our journey through time unfolds, you might begin to realize that a day in the life of a medieval individual was far from the romanticized versions often depicted in popular culture. For the average person living in medieval Europe, life was far from easy. The day would begin at dawn with the first light of the sun. Most people lived in small, one-room houses with thatched roofs. These houses offered little in the way of privacy or comfort. The floor was typically made of dirt, and the only furniture would be a rough-hewn table and benches. In the corner, there would be a small fire pit for cooking and warmth. The house would often be shared with livestock, adding to the discomfort. Upon rising, the medieval individual would start their day by attending to their chores, primarily dictated by their particular social status and occupation. The majority of people were peasants, working the land for their feudal lord. Their day would be spent in hard labor, tilling the fields, planting crops, and taking care of the livestock. They would work from sunup to sundown, with only a short break for lunch. Food in the medieval period was also a far cry from what we are accustomed to today. The average diet consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and vegetables. Meat was a luxury few could afford, and fruits were only available seasonally. The lack of variety and nutrition in the diet often led to health problems, including malnutrition and scurvy. For those living in towns and cities, life was somewhat different, but no less harsh. The streets were narrow, crowded, and dirty, with waste and garbage often thrown into the street. Sanitation was a major problem, leading to frequent outbreaks of disease. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. On top of these physical hardships, there was also the psychological toll of living in a society where life was cheap and violence was commonplace. The threat of war was ever present, with kingdoms and fiefdoms constantly in conflict. Public executions were common, and the rule of law was often arbitrary and brutal. Yet, despite these hardships, people in the medieval period found ways to enjoy life. They celebrated festivals and holidays with great enthusiasm, often involving music, dance, and copious amounts of alcohol. Religion also played a major role in their lives, providing a sense of purpose and community. Religion wasn't just a matter of personal belief, but a central part of everyday life. The church played a significant role in the community, providing not only spiritual guidance, but also basic social services. The local priest would often be the only person in the village who could read and write. He would perform weddings, funerals, and baptisms, and also provide basic medical care. In conclusion, life in the medieval period was a constant struggle for survival. It was a time of harsh realities where the average person lived a life of hard labor, poor nutrition, and constant uncertainty. Yet, it was also a time of deep faith and communal bonds, where people found joy in the simple pleasures of life. If you were to spend a day in medieval times, you would likely find it a challenging but also a profoundly human experience. As we continue to delve further into the medieval era, we will explore more about the intricacies of daily life, the societal structure, and the cultural beliefs that shaped this fascinating period in history. So close your eyes and imagine a world far removed from our own, where life was simple yet fraught with challenges. We'll continue our journey through the ages, immersing ourselves in the sights, sounds, and experiences of medieval times. Forget about trending videos or popular music. Your daily entertainment would be hard work and simple community gatherings. As we continue our journey into the gripping yet often unsettling world of medieval times, let us now turn our attention to the intricate social order of the period, which was a far cry from what we are accustomed to in our modern democratic societies. In the medieval world, where you were born and to whom had a profound impact on your lot in life, the social structure was rigidly hierarchical, and opportunities for social mobility were few and far between. At the top of the social pyramid was the monarch, the ultimate authority who ruled by divine right. The king was the law. His word was final, and his power was absolute. Just below the king were the nobles. The nobility was a privileged class enjoying wealth, power, and prestige. They owned vast tracts of land, lived in opulent castles, and commanded private armies. Yet they too had obligations. They were expected to provide military service to the king, administer justice, and maintain order in their territories. Beneath the nobles were the knights, a warrior class who owed their allegiance to a lord. Knights were professional soldiers, trained from a young age to fight in the king's wars. They were rewarded with land and privileges, but their lives were not easy. They were expected to be brave, loyal, and honorable, to uphold the chivalric code, and to be ready to lay down their lives for their lord and king. Next came the clergy, who held a unique position in medieval society. They were not only spiritual leaders, but also wielded significant temporal power. The church was the richest and most powerful institution in medieval Europe, owning vast estates, collecting tithes, and exercising influence over all levels of society. The clergy were often the only literate people in the community, and they played a crucial role in education, charity, and administration. And then, at the bottom of the social pyramid, were the peasants. This was the largest and most disadvantaged group in medieval society. They worked the land, tilled the fields, and tended the livestock, their labor providing the food and other resources that sustained the entire society. Yet they were often treated as little more than chattels, tied to the land and their lord, with few rights and little hope of improving their circumstances. Life as a peasant was hard and unrelenting. The working day started at dawn and ended at dusk, with only a few short breaks for meals. The work was physically demanding, and there was no respite, no weekends, no holidays. And yet, the fruits of their labor mostly went to their lord in the form of rent, taxes, and services. Food was simple and monotonous. A typical diet consisted of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat and fish being a rare luxury. Clothing was coarse and practical, made from wool or linen, and often worn until it fell apart. Homes were small, dark, and crowded, with entire families living in a single room. Peasants were subject to the will of their lord, who had the power to decide almost every aspect of their lives. They could be bought, sold, or given away at their lord's whim. They were subject to harsh punishments for any transgressions, real or imagined, and they had little recourse to justice, as the legal system was heavily biased in favor of the nobility. Despite these hardships, the peasants were not entirely without agency. They had their own customs and traditions, their own ways of making sense of the world. They celebrated the changing seasons, the harvest, and the holy days, finding joy and solace in their communities and their faith. And so, as we reach the end of this section of our journey, let us take a moment to reflect on the resilience and tenacity of the human spirit. Even in the face of such adversity, the world of the medieval peasant may seem harsh and unforgiving to us now, but it was their reality, their everyday life. And they found ways to endure, to survive, and even to thrive in their own humble way. So as you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of their lives, their struggles, and their triumphs lull you into a deep, peaceful slumber, filled with dreams of a time long past, yet not entirely forgotten. And remember, as the dawn of a new day breaks, that we too have our challenges, our struggles, and our triumphs. And that we too are part of the great tapestry of human history, every bit as complex, as vibrant, and as fascinating as the world of medieval times. Good night. No viral challenges from Merbeast or K-pop idols to distract you here, just the harsh realities of your feudal status. As we continue on our journey through the Middle Ages, let's shift our focus to the daily life of the common people. It's easy to imagine the glamorous knights and the grandeur of lofty castles, but the reality of medieval times was often far from this romanticized vision. To truly understand the challenges of this era, we must delve into the life of the everyday folk who formed the backbone of medieval society. The majority of people in the Middle Ages were peasants, and their daily lives revolved around hard work. They lived in small villages and worked on the land, growing crops or rearing animals. The day began at dawn with the crowing of the rooster. A peasant's life was dictated by the sun and the seasons. In winter months, when there was less daylight, they would rise later. But in summer, they would often be up before sunrise, getting ready for a long day of toil in the fields. Their homes were simple, usually one or two room structures made of wood or wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The floor was typically compacted earth, and there was a hole in the roof to let out smoke from the fire. Furniture was minimal and crude, and they slept on straw pallets covered with skins or coarse cloth. A peasant's home was also the place where they would eat, sleep, and work on their craft, be it weaving, brewing, or blacksmithing. Work was relentless for the medieval peasant. Their primary responsibility was to produce food. They would plow, sow seeds, and harvest crops. They also took care of animals, milked cows, made cheese, and collected eggs. In addition to this, they were also responsible for building and repairing their homes and tools. Every member of the family, including children, was expected to contribute in some way. Beyond their grueling work, peasants also had obligations to their lord. In return for the right to live on and work a piece of land, they owed their lord a certain number of days' labor each year. This was called the corvée and could include tasks like building roads, bridges and fortifications, or harvesting the lord's crops. The diet of a medieval peasant was simple and monotonous. They ate a lot of bread, usually made from rye or barley, as well as vegetables like cabbage, beans, onions, and peas. Meat was a rare luxury and was typically reserved for special occasions. Instead, they often ate fish, which they could catch themselves in local rivers or streams. Their drink was usually ale or beer, as water was often unsafe to drink. Despite the hardship, there were moments of joy and community in a peasant's life. They celebrated the changing of the seasons, the harvest, and religious holidays with feasts, music, and dance. These moments of mirth and merriment provided a much-needed break from the monotony of their everyday life. However, a medieval peasant's life was fraught with uncertainty. Crop failure due to bad weather or pests could lead to famine, and even in good times, the threat of disease was ever present. Without modern medicine, a simple infection could become deadly. Moreover, the constant threat of war loomed over their heads. If their village was in the path of an advancing army, they could lose everything. In understanding the life of the medieval peasant, we can appreciate the immense challenges they faced. Their existence was often brutal and short, yet they endured, and their labor laid the foundation for the society we know today. As we close this section, let's take a moment to reflect on the resilience of these humble folk who toiled from dawn till dusk, and whose stories are often overshadowed by the grand tales of knights and kings. Your daily routine would be far from the curated experiences of modern media. No trending Asmir to relax you, just the call of the rooster and the demands of the fields. In medieval times, the majority of the populace were serfs, a type of peasant who worked the land. The very land they toiled on was owned by a lord, who in turn owed allegiance to a higher lord, and so on up to the king. A serf's life was one of relentless labor, and their daily existence was dictated by the changing seasons and the demands of their lord. They would start their day at the crack of dawn, with the first light of day serving as their alarm clock. Their day would begin with feeding their animals, which often included cows, sheep, and chickens. The animals were vital to a serf's livelihood, providing milk, wool, eggs, and occasionally meat. Following this, the serfs would head to the fields. Depending on the time of year, they might be sowing seeds, harvesting crops, or plowing the fields. These tasks were physically demanding and involved hours of backbreaking work, often under the harsh elements. There were no weekends or holidays for a serf. Their work was never truly done. After a long day in the fields, the serfs would return home. Their homes were simple, one-room structures, often shared with their animals. There was no glass in the windows, the floors were made of hard-packed earth, and the only furniture would be a rough wooden table and stools. Dinner would be a simple affair, consisting of dark bread made from a type of grain called rye, and a thin soup made from vegetables grown in their garden. Meat was a rarity, saved for special occasions. They would eat their meal by the light of a tallow candle made from animal fat. Despite the hardships of their daily life, serfs found joy in simple pleasures. They would often sing songs while they worked in the fields, a practice that helped to lighten the load of their labor. On Sundays, they would attend church, a mandatory requirement, but also a chance to socialize with their neighbors. However, serfdom was not a static condition. There were different ways in which a serf could gain freedom. Some bought their way out of serfdom, while others were set free by their lords as a reward for exceptional service. In some cases, a serf could also gain freedom by escaping to a city and living there for a year and a day without being claimed by their lord. The life of a serf was a life of unending toil and hardship. However, it was also a life of community, of shared experiences, of resilience in the face of adversity. It's important to remember that despite the challenges they faced, medieval serfs were not merely passive victims of their circumstances. They found ways to survive, to create joy, to forge connections with their fellow serfs, and to carve out a sense of identity amidst the constraints of their status. As we weave through the tapestry of history, it becomes clear that our modern conveniences are a product of centuries of progress. The next time you find yourself longing for the simplicity of a bygone era, consider the serfs of medieval times. Their lives were anything but simple, filled with hard labor, constant uncertainty, and a lack of basic comforts. In the next section, we will delve deeper into the social hierarchy of medieval times and explore the lives of the lords and ladies. But for now, let the sound of my voice and the images of medieval life lull you into a peaceful sleep. Remember, the past is a different country. They do things differently there. As we journey through history, we gain a greater appreciation for the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the stories of the past guide you into dreamland. Good night. No streaming your favorite songs or watching online gaming tournaments here. Just the quiet hum of the fields and the prayers of the church. As we continue our exploration of daily life in the medieval times, we now turn our attention to the often harsh and challenging living conditions. The comforts of modern life that we take for granted would be far from possible in the medieval era. In medieval times, most people lived in small rural villages. The houses were typically made of wattle and daub. The roofs were thatched with straw or reeds. These humble dwellings provided some protection from the elements, but they were far from comfortable. There were no glass windows, only shutters that could be closed to keep out the cold. The floors were simply compacted earth, covered in straw to provide some insulation. Within these homes, families lived in close quarters. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. In most cases, the entire family would sleep in the same room, often in the same bed. Furniture was sparse, consisting of a table, perhaps a few benches or stools, and a chest for storing belongings. Life was dictated by the rhythms of nature. People rose with the sun and went to bed when it set. They ate what they could grow or raise themselves. The diet was predominantly plant-based, with a heavy reliance on grains. Bread was the staple food, supplemented by vegetables, fruits, and occasionally meat. Medieval people had to be self-reliant. They made their own clothes, grew their own food, and built their own homes. They had to know how to care for animals, mend fences, and repair tools. Every member of the family had a role to play, from the youngest child to the oldest adult. Healthcare as we understand it today did not exist. People relied on a mixture of folk remedies, herbal medicines, and religious rituals to treat illness. Disease was a constant threat made worse by poor sanitation and a lack of understanding about how diseases spread. Plagues and epidemics were common and mortality rates were high. The concept of leisure time was also foreign to the medieval mind. Every waking hour was consumed by the struggle to survive. There were no weekends, no holidays, and no vacations. Entertainment was limited to occasional feasts or festivals, often linked to religious holidays. The role of religion was central to medieval life. The church was not just a place of worship, but also a community center, a school, and often the largest and most impressive building in the village. Religious rituals and observances punctuated the daily routine, providing a sense of structure and order amid the uncertainty of life. Despite these hardships, people in the medieval times found ways to endure and even to thrive. They formed close-knit communities, relying on each other for support and mutual aid. They developed skills and crafts that are still admired today, and they left us a rich cultural legacy in the form of literature, art, architecture, and music. Living in the medieval times was undoubtedly challenging, but it was also a time of innovation and resilience, of community and faith, of strength and perseverance. It was a time that shaped our world in countless ways, and its influence can still be felt today. As we come to the end of our exploration of the medieval era, let us remember not just the hardships and challenges, but also the achievements and the enduring legacy of this fascinating period in history. As we drift off to sleep, we can take comfort in the knowledge that we are the beneficiaries of centuries of human ingenuity and resilience, and that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Good night and sleep well. Imagine trying to create a viral video or listen to karaoke when your basic living conditions are so precarious. As we journey back to medieval times, we find ourselves in the midst of a bustling town. The air is dense with the aroma of freshly baked bread, the sound of blacksmith hammers striking metal, and the hum of a busy market. Yet beneath this seemingly idyllic facade, a harsh reality lurked that dictated the rhythm of everyday life. Let's step into the shoes of a common peasant. As a serf, you would be part of the lowest social class, bound to the land and subject to the will of the local lord. Your day would start before sunrise as the rooster crowed, signaling the start of your labor. You'd likely live in a small, simple home made of wattle and daub, with a thatch roof, a far cry from the comforts of modern living. The home would be shared with your family and possibly some livestock, as animals were often brought inside for warmth and protection from thieves. Your diet would be far from varied or nutritious. You'd eat a lot of bread made from barley or rye, and perhaps supplemented by vegetables like beans and cabbages. Meat would be a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions or the local lord's table. Instead, you might have a bit of cheese or a few eggs from your chickens. You would drink ale or mead, as water was often unsafe to drink. The work was backbreaking. You'd toil in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, tending to the livestock, and performing any other tasks the Lord required. The work was not only physically exhausting but monotonous, leaving little time for leisure or personal growth. Education was a privilege reserved for the clergy and the nobility, so you'd most likely be illiterate, relying on the local priests for information about the world beyond your village. Healthcare in medieval times was primitive at best. The prevailing theory was that of the four humors. It was believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humors, and treatments often involved bloodletting or purging. Without the knowledge of germs or proper sanitation, disease spread quickly and life expectancy was low. The church played a significant role in everyday life. Sundays and holy days were reserved for worship, and failing to attend Mass could result in punishment. The church was also the center of social life where villagers gathered for festivals and fairs. However, the church also wielded significant power and could excommunicate anyone who violated its laws, effectively cutting them off from society. As a serf, you wouldn't have the freedom to choose your own destiny. You couldn't leave the land without permission from the Lord, and your children would inherit your status. The concept of upward mobility was virtually non-existent, and the idea of individual rights would not emerge for centuries. Despite these harsh realities, medieval times were not without their moments of joy and camaraderie. There were festivals and feasts, celebrations of the changing seasons, and the simple pleasure of a job well done. Music, dance, and storytelling were integral parts of the culture, providing respite from the hardships of everyday life. As we return to the present, it's clear that our lives are vastly different from those of our medieval ancestors. We enjoy comforts and freedoms they could hardly imagine. Yet it's also worth remembering the resilience and determination of these people who lived and loved, worked and played in a world so different from our own. Their stories remind us of the human capacity to adapt and endure, to find joy in the midst of hardship, and to create a sense of community and purpose, even in the most challenging circumstances. No gaming streams, no trending political debates, no azamze relaxation to escape to just the raw demands of daily survival in a crowded, unsanitary town. As we continue our journey through the daily life of a person in the medieval period, let's turn our attention to the aspect of health and medicine. If you were living in medieval times, you might find the healthcare system significantly different from what we know today. The understanding of disease, its causes, and treatment was extremely limited, and life expectancy was short due to various health problems. The knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary at best. The practice of dissecting human bodies to understand their workings was considered taboo and often illegal, leaving many physicians to guess at the inner workings of the human body. This lack of understanding led to many misconceptions and misdiagnoses. The belief in the four humors was prevalent. These were thought to be bodily fluids that needed to be in balance for a person to stay healthy. Any imbalance was considered the root cause of all diseases and illnesses. In terms of treatment, bloodletting was a common practice. The idea was to drain the body of excess bad humors. Leeches were often used for this purpose. In today's medical understanding, this practice is largely considered harmful and ineffective, but in medieval times, it was a widely accepted form of treatment, often leading to weakness and sometimes death due to loss of blood. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was another factor that would make it hard for a modern person to survive in medieval times. Bathing wasn't a regular practice and was often considered an indulgence. The concept of germs and sanitation was not understood, leading to widespread diseases. The Black Death, a plague that wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, is a stark testament to this lack of sanitation and understanding of disease transmission. Medieval diets also played a significant role in the health of the people. The lower classes subsisted on a diet of mostly grain like barley and rye, with little meat or fresh fruit and vegetables. This lack of a balanced diet often led to malnutrition, weakening the immune system and making people more susceptible to diseases. Dentistry, too, was a field in its infancy. Tooth decay was a common problem, often leading to dangerous infections. Without the understanding of dental hygiene and effective treatments, toothaches were often a lifelong issue for many. Childbirth was a particularly dangerous time for women. There was a lack of understanding about cleanliness and the need for sterile environments during childbirth, leading to a high rate of maternal and infant mortality. Midwives, not formally trained physicians, usually attended births. Their knowledge was based on experience rather than formal education, leading to many complications and fatalities. Despite these challenges, there were some advancements in medicine during the medieval period. The creation of universities in the 12th century led to the development of medical schools where knowledge was collected and taught. Monasteries served as places of healing, with monks often having knowledge of herbs and remedies. This period also saw the emergence of hospitals, though they were more places for the poor and the sick to go to die, rather than institutions for healing and recovery as we know them today. In conclusion, health, and medicine in the medieval period were fraught with challenges. The lack of understanding about the human body, disease, and hygiene made it a dangerous time to be alive. The treatments available were often ineffective and sometimes harmful. However, it was also a time of slow progress, with the foundations of modern medicine being laid. As we move to the final section of this journey, let's ponder on the resilience of the human spirit and the drive for survival that saw people through these challenging times. Imagine trying to research your symptoms on a search engine or watch a medical explicable video when the very concept of germs is unknown and treatments are based on archaic beliefs. As we continue our peaceful journey through the heart of the medieval period, we find ourselves shifting our focus from the bustling life of the cities and castles to the quieter but no less important rural countryside. Here, in the vast expanses of fields and forests, the majority of the medieval population made their living as farmers and laborers, their lives intimately tied to the rhythm of the seasons and the bounty of the earth. Life in a medieval village was far from the romanticized tales of chivalry and courtly love associated with this era. It was characterized by a simplicity and routine that for many modern individuals would be unbearably monotonous. The day for a medieval peasant would begin at dawn with the crowing of the roosters. After a simple breakfast, often consisting of bread, cheese, and weak ale, they would head out to the fields for a long day of labor. The agricultural practices of the medieval period were rudimentary by today's standards. Without the benefit of modern machinery, every task was performed by hand. Plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting were all physically demanding activities that required strength, endurance, and a great deal of patience. Despite their hard work, the yield from their labor was often meager. Poor soil quality, unpredictable weather, and rampant crop diseases meant that failure and famine were constant threats. The diet of a medieval peasant was similarly austere. They subsisted primarily on a diet of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with occasional small amounts of cheese and meat. The monotony of their diet was occasionally broken by the availability of seasonal fruits, nuts, and berries. However, these were often preserved for the winter months when food was scarce. Health and hygiene were another area where the medieval period fell short by modern standards. Without understanding the principles of germ theory and sanitation, illness was rampant and often deadly. Child mortality rates were high and life expectancy was low. Common ailments like toothaches, colds, and digestive issues were often treated with a mix of folk remedies and superstition. More serious illnesses like the plague could wipe out entire communities. Despite these hardships, the life of a medieval peasant was not without its small joys and comforts. The village was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, and social activities like dances, feasts, and fairs provided much-needed relief from the daily grind. The church, too, was a central part of village life, providing spiritual comfort and a sense of order in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. The medieval period was also a time of innovation and progress in many areas. Advances in technology such as the heavy plow and the horse collar made farming more efficient. The establishment of guilds and the development of trade routes helped stimulate economic growth. The construction of cathedrals, castles, and universities reflected the period's artistic and intellectual achievements. Yet for all its progress, the medieval world was a place of profound inequality. The feudal system, which governed social and economic relations, was heavily weighted in favor of the nobility and the clergy. Peasants had few rights and little opportunity for social mobility. Their lives were defined by their labor, and their status was determined by their birth. Reflecting on the realities of life in the medieval period, it is easy to understand why we as modern individuals might find it difficult to last a day in this era. The physical demands, the lack of comfort, the constant uncertainty, these challenges would test even the most resilient among us. Yet there's also a certain beauty in the simplicity, a reminder of the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit. As we drift further into the tranquil embrace of sleep, let us carry with us this sense of gratitude for the comforts and conveniences of our modern life, and a newfound appreciation for the TRILs and triumphs of our medieval ancestors. No need for catchy song titles or viral challenges to mark your days. The rhythm of the seasons and the cycle of survival were your only guides. As our journey through the annals of history continues, we find ourselves delving into an era of knights, castles, and feudal society, the medieval times. Picture yourself, if you will, transported back through the centuries, landing in a world far removed from the one we inhabit today. It's a time of stark contrast where the wealthy live in fortified castles while the poor toil in the fields. It's a time where the church wields immense power and one's fate is often dictated by the whims of their lord. As we begin to explore this fascinating era, we can start to understand why the comforts and conveniences we take for granted today would make it incredibly challenging for a contemporary person to survive a day in medieval times. Firstly, let's consider the living conditions. If you were a peasant, which was the most likely scenario given that the vast majority of people belong to the peasant class, your dwelling would be a small one-room cottage. This cottage, made of wattle and daub, would be shared with both your family and your animals. The floor would be strewn with straw and covered in animal dung, while the air would be thick with the smell of smoke from the central hearth, a far cry from our modern houses with separate rooms, indoor plumbing, and central heating. Then there's the matter of food. If you were a peasant, your diet would consist largely of pottage, a type of thick stew made from whatever vegetables were in season, along with some grain, perhaps barley or oats. Meat would be a rare luxury, and fresh fruit and vegetables would be scarce during the long winter months. Fast food, convenience meals, and the abundance of food we enjoy today would be unimaginable in the medieval era. The daily routine would be grueling. As a peasant, you would be expected to work the fields from dawn until dusk, regardless of the weather. There would be little time for leisure or relaxation, and your duties would extend beyond farming to include tasks such as repairing the Lord's road or building his castle. This is a stark contrast to our modern work-life balance where we have the luxury of weekends, holidays, and the ability to work from home. Healthcare, or rather the lack thereof, is another factor that would make survival in the medieval times challenging. Without our modern understanding of germs and disease, medieval doctors often resorted to dubious treatments such as bloodletting and leech therapy. Add to this a lack of sanitation and the prevalence of diseases such as the plague, and it's clear that staying healthy in the medieval era would be a formidable task. In addition to these physical challenges, there would also be social and cultural obstacles to navigate. As a peasant, your life would be governed by the will of the lord of the manor. You could be called upon to fight in his wars, and your life would be subject to the whims of his justice. The concept of individual rights and freedoms, which we take for granted today, would be largely absent in the medieval era. And let's not forget about the influence of the church. In the medieval times, the church was not just a place of worship, but also a significant political and social institution. The church dictated moral standards, influenced laws, and even played a role in education. The concept of religious freedom as we understand it today would be alien in this context. Lastly, consider the lack of technological conveniences. Without electricity, there would be no lighting after sunset except for candles or oil lamps. There would be no telephones, no internet, no cars or trains, and certainly no smartphones or computers. Even simple tasks such as washing clothes or preparing food would be labor-intensive and time-consuming. In conclusion, while the medieval era is a fascinating period to study, it's clear that the harsh living conditions, The lack of modern conveniences and the rigid social structures would make it incredibly difficult for a person from our time to survive a day in this era. But as we continue to delve deeper into this period, we allow gain a greater appreciation for the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors who not only survived, but thrived in these challenging times. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, spare a thought for our medieval ancestors and take a moment to appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. And remember, history is not just about understanding the past, but also about gaining perspective on the present. Good night. You wouldn't be watching Merbeast or listening to the latest song on a device. Your daily reality would be dictated by survival and servitude. As the early morning fog lifts slowly from the cobblestone streets, we find ourselves in a bustling medieval town center. The air is filled with noise, the clatter of horse hooves, the chatter of townsfolk, the hammering of blacksmiths, and the cry of street vendors. Life in medieval times was far from quiet, a cacophony of sounds from dawn to dusk, a symphony of existence in an era that was anything but peaceful. If you were a serf, the lowest social class, your day would begin long before the sun rose. Serfs were bound to the land, effectively owned by the local lord. They had no rights and were forced to work long hours, often in the fields tending to crops and livestock. Despite the backbreaking labor, serfs were not paid. Instead, they were given a small piece of land to grow their own food. Even children as young as 7 were expected to contribute, their small hands perfect for tasks such as pulling weeds or feeding chickens. The diet of a medieval serf was simple and monotonous. Breakfast, if you were fortunate enough to have it, might consist of a hunk of bread and a bit of cheese. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was typically a vegetable pottage, a thick soup made from whatever was available: cabbage, onions, leeks, and beans. Meat was a luxury saved for special occasions, and the average serf only tasted it a few times a year. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was another challenge of medieval life. Baths were infrequent, with most people washing just their hands and face. This lack of personal hygiene, combined with unsanitary living conditions, led to a multitude of health problems. Fleas and lice were common, as were skin diseases and infections. It's no surprise that the average life expectancy was only around 30 years. Medieval towns were not only noisy and dirty, they were also dangerous places to live. Without a police force, crime was rampant and punishment was harsh. Thieves could be publicly humiliated in the stocks, while more serious crimes could result in execution. Fire was another ever-present danger. Most buildings were made of wood and packed closely together, so a single spark could result in a devastating blaze. For the nobility, life was considerably more comfortable, but it had its own set of challenges. The noble class was expected to provide military service to the king, which often meant leaving home for months at a time. Women in the noble class had a little more freedom than their peasant counterparts, but they were still expected to marry for political advantage and produce heirs. Medieval life was a constant struggle for survival. From the backbreaking labor of serfs to the political maneuvering of nobility, everyone had their part to play in this complex societal structure. And yet, despite the hardships, people found joy in their lives. They celebrated with feasts and festivals, made beautiful works of art, and told stories that have been passed down through the ages. As we journey further into the medieval times, we'll delve deeper into the daily lives of the people, their beliefs, and their culture. We'll explore the role of the church, the rise of universities, and the flowering of literature and art. Despite the hardships, there's a lot to admire about this resilient society, which has left an indelible mark on our own. And as the twilight descends on our medieval town, we are left with a sense of awe and appreciation for the people who lived, loved, and survived in these challenging times. So, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the cobblestone streets, the bustling markets, and the grand castles of the medieval times. Picture the serfs tending to their fields, the nobility riding off to war, and the children playing in the streets. Despite the hardships, there's a beauty and resilience in this era that continues to captivate us centuries later. And as you drift off to sleep, let the sounds, sights, and stories of the medieval times lull you into peaceful dreams. The closest thing to a trending video would be a traveling minstrel's tale, or perhaps news from the king, rather than anything related to ASMR or Minecraft. As we delve deeper into the daily life of people in medieval times, one cannot overlook the crucial role of labor and work. Each morning, as dawn broke, the serfs who made up the majority of the population in medieval Europe were roused from their slumber to begin their tasks. Their day usually started at the crack of dawn, often even before the sun had broken the horizon. The concept of a weekend didn't exist, and the serfs toiled from dusk till dawn, 6 days a week. With only the Sabbath day off for religious observance, the labor was intense and grueling. Serfs were essentially peasants who worked on the Lord's land in exchange for protection. They cultivated fields, tended to animals, and performed any other tasks that the Lord deemed necessary. From sowing seeds in the fields to threshing the harvested grain, every task was manual, often involving heavy lifting and strenuous physical activity. The tools were rudimentary, made from wood and iron, and required considerable strength and endurance to operate. A serf's life was not their own. Their existence was dictated by the demands of their lord and the seasons. Not only were the working conditions harsh, but the serfs also lived in a state of constant insecurity, as they had no rights or freedoms. They were at the complete mercy of their lords. They could be evicted from their homes, their meager possessions seized, or their families torn apart at the whim of their lord. In addition, they were obliged to pay crippling taxes and rents, often in the form of crops or labor. This chronic uncertainty and lack of control over their own lives made for a stressful existence. The diet of the medieval serf was as bland and monotonous as their life. Their meals predominantly consisted of dark bread made from rye or barley, and pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally a small amount of meat. The meat was a luxury that was rarely afforded to them, reserved for special occasions or during the winter months. They drank ale or mead, as water was often contaminated and unsafe to drink. Fruits and vegetables were part of their diet, but these were seasonal and not always readily available. The medical care during the medieval period was rudimentary at best. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and most treatments were based on superstition and folklore rather than science. Illnesses were often attributed to supernatural causes, and the remedies were equally bizarre. Bloodletting, for instance, was a common treatment for a variety of ailments. The idea was to balance the four humors of the body by removing the excess blood. It was believed that the balance could be restored, thereby curing the disease. Needless to say, this often did more harm than good. In addition to the physical hardships, the mental strain was equally taxing. The life of a serf was monotonous and unchanging, with few opportunities for leisure or recreation. The church provided some solace with its promise of a better life in the hereafter. The serfs clung to their faith, finding comfort in the rituals and ceremonies of the church. The occasional feast days and holy days offered a respite from the drudgery of daily life and were eagerly anticipated. Life in a medieval city was not much better than in the countryside. The cities were crowded and filthy, with narrow, winding streets and inadequate sanitation. Disease was rampant, and epidemics were common. The houses were small and cramped, often housing multiple families. The air was polluted with smoke from the many fireplaces and the stench from the open sewers. The daily grind of a craftsman in a city was not much different from that of a serf. He too worked from dawn till dusk, 6 days a week. However, unlike serfs, craftsmen had the opportunity to improve their lot through skill and hard work. They could become masters of their craft, own their own shops, and even become wealthy. However, this was not easy and required years of apprenticeship and hard work. In conclusion, life in the medieval times was a constant struggle for survival. Whether you were a serf toiling in the fields or a craftsman plying your trade in a city, the daily grind was grueling. The harsh working conditions, poor diet, inadequate medical care, and constant insecurity made life in the medieval times extremely challenging, to say the least. One cannot help but feel a sense of relief and gratitude for the comforts and conveniences of modern life. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us take a moment to appreciate the hardships our ancestors endured and the progress we have made. Good night. No time to binge watch a popular gaming series or listen to your favorite song on repeat when your very survival depends on relentless physical labor. In our journey through the Middle Ages, we've traversed the social hierarchy, the daily chores, the cuisine, and the challenges of health and hygiene. Now, let's turn our attention to another harsher aspect of medieval life, the justice system. In the Middle Ages, the concept of justice was very different from what we understand today. Modern legal systems are built on the principle of innocent until proven guilty, but in medieval times, things were quite the opposite. The burden of proving innocence often fell on the accused, and failure to do so could result in severe punishment. Witch trials are perhaps the most infamous example of medieval justice, but they were by no means the only form of trial. Trial by combat, trial by ordeal, and compurgation were all methods employed, each one more terrifying than the last. Trial by combat, for example, was exactly as it sounds. The accused and the accuser would fight, and God would supposedly grant victory to the innocent party. It is not hard to imagine how this system could be easily manipulated by those with strength or fighting skill. Trial by ordeal was similarly gruesome. The accused would be subjected to a physically painful or dangerous task, such as carrying a hot iron for a certain distance or retrieving a stone from a pot of boiling water. If their wounds healed cleanly within a set time, they were considered innocent. If not, they were guilty. This method was based on the belief that God would intervene on behalf of the innocent, a notion that seems dangerously naive to us now. Compurgation, on the other hand, required the accused to swear an oath of innocence, backed by a group of oath helpers who would vouch for their honesty. This method relied heavily on one's reputation within the community and could be easily skewed by personal bias. Punishments for crimes varied widely, from fines to corporal punishment to death. The severity of the punishment often depended on the social status of the accused and the nature of the crime. For instance, a nobleman might be fined for a crime that would earn a peasant a whipping or worse. Beyond the legal system, violence was a common part of everyday life in the Middle Ages. Raids and skirmishes were frequent, and personal safety was far from guaranteed. The lack of a centralized police force meant that people had to take their safety into their own hands, often leading to brutal reprisals and cycles of violence. And then there were the wars. The Middle Ages were a time of near constant conflict, from the Crusades to the 100 Years' War. These wars were not only deadly, but also incredibly disruptive to everyday life. They could lead to food shortages, displacement, and widespread destruction. In addition to these physical hardships, the psychological toll of living in such uncertain times cannot be understated. The constant threat of violence, the fear of accusation, and the general unpredictability of life would have been incredibly stressful. It's hard to imagine getting a good night's sleep under such conditions. Despite these hardships, people in the Middle Ages found ways to adapt and survive. They developed systems of mutual aid and protection like guilds and confraternities. They sought solace in religion and found joy in festivals and feasts. But even so, it's clear that life in the Middle Ages was far from easy. The harsh realities of medieval justice, the ever-present threat of violence, And the psychological stress of living in such a time would be enough to challenge even the hardiest of souls. It as a stark reminder of how far we've come and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As we close this chapter, let's take a moment to appreciate the relative comfort and security of our modern lives. While we still face challenges and uncertainties, they pale in comparison to the trials of medieval times. So as you drift off to sleep, be grateful for the peace and safety of your own bed and for the progress that has been made over the centuries. Good night. No viral legal analyses or true crime documentaries to binge watch here. Your understanding of justice would be brutal and immediate,